Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday, August 27th edition of the MMAOB Daily Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Adam Martin, and I'll be taking you guys through the latest in the world of mixed martial arts. Hope everyone's doing really well. Obviously, we have UFC on ESPN Plus 33 on Saturday. Be sure to check out Tuesday's podcast. Myself and Cole Sheldon broke down all the fights in the card. One fight did change. I told you guys something's going to happen. One of these fights is going to fall out, at least one. Maybe another one will tomorrow. Hopefully not, but with the way things have been going, it seems like a lot of fights fall at last minute these days. But yeah, we'll talk about that new replacement fight. Dana White's Contender Series took place on Tuesday. I'll recap that. There's some news and fight announcements to get to, so let's get right into today's podcast. All right, I'm going to start with Contender Series 30. So we'll start with that right now. Dana White's Contender Series took place on Tuesday once again, and overall, another solid card, and they handed out 4 contracts. So Dana White's been handing out contracts at a record pace this season. You compare it to previous years, you got to kind of feel bad for some of the fighters that have been on the show in the first couple of seasons where they had good performances, finishes even in some cases, and Dana White decided not to sign them. This year, it's like, if you get a finish, you're in. I think he's literally signed everyone who's got a finish on the show, and most of the guys have got decisions as well, except for a few in particular, including one on this card that I will talk about. That was kind of controversial, I guess. So let's start with the bottom, work way up. Middleweight fight, open up the card. Colin Huckbody, man, he didn't even need more than, not much more than a minute. Minute 28, taps out Kyron Bowen, arm triangle choke. He was the favorite heading in this fight. I think a lot of people, including me, expected him to win this fight. The thing is, like, what do we learn about him from this fight? That's the only question I have. Like, he got the win. He looked good, obviously. When he got the finish in a minute, you knew he was going to get signed, but did we learn anything more about him that we already didn't know? I don't know. So, yes, like, I have no problem with him getting signed, but I'd like to see this guy face a little bit more adversity. That's the one issue with finishing your fight so early. You didn't show that you had the cardio and stuff like that, but it's hard to fault the guy for getting a finish. So, obviously, he's going to get a contract. He's in the UFC now. Next up, Anthony Romero defeats Mike Breeden via unanimous decision. He did not get a deal. This was an interesting fight. Romero, he's definitely good. I mean, he's technical. He's got good striking and pretty good wrestling. But Mike Breeden was hurt so bad. The kicks, especially, were absolutely devastating. That third round, I have no idea how this guy didn't fall down and lose via leg kick TKO, but somehow he kept pressing forward and was able to grind out the full 15 minutes here. That's the reason Dana White didn't sign him. He looks at this guy and says, hey, this guy can't finish an opponent that is literally walking around on like one leg, can't finish him. Why should I sign him to the UFC? So that's definitely been a controversial decision since he wasn't signed. A lot of people thinking, this was a mistake on Dana's part. Dana afterwards said, if he's so good, maybe Bellator or one of these big promotions can go and pick him up and prove me wrong. Like, he said that about a few other guys, like Brendan Lofton especially. The thing about Dana is, it's like when he gets this, like, feeling in his mind that this guy's not UFC worthy, it's very hard to convince him otherwise. And we saw it with Brendan Lofton in last season. Even though, and the guy he lost to, he beat Bill Algeo, the guy that lost to him, he's in the UFC now. But Brendan's in PFL and in purgatory there because we don't even know what's going on with them. So when Dana White's like got his mindset on something, it's hard to convince him. He's a stubborn guy, and in this case, maybe someone told him, hey, Romero's very talented, let's bring him in, but he was convinced this guy's not UFC caliber because he didn't finish the fight and because he didn't finish an opponent that was hurt that badly. So to be honest with you, like, obviously I wanted to see this guy in the UFC because he's Canadian. It's nice to have a Canadian in the UFC. He's a good prospect, but I could see it from Dana White's point of view, and honestly, I don't have a problem with him passing. You can't sign everyone from the show. Like, there's no point of having the show if they're just going to sign everyone. So in my opinion, I can actually see why he decided to pass on him. The next fight also went distance, but Dana did decide the winner. Jeff Molina, he defeats Jacob Silva in a really good fight here at flyweight. He wins a unanimous decision. It was a fun fight, back and forth. Both guys pretty much laying it on the line. Jacob Silva, man, what a chin. And they were showing the replay of the fight at the end of it. And it's just like, this guy's just taking bombs to his chin and somehow survived it. Good fight. Obviously, the UFC is always looking for flyweights. So even though Molina did not get the finish, I have no problem with him getting signed. Next up, Rafael Alves defeats Alejandro Flores via submission. And yeah, I mean, it was a nice performance. And this guy's so experienced. He's a guy that should have been in the UFC probably already. So he now makes it to the UFC. He's on a 5-fight win streak. I expect him to get a quick booking. He'll probably get a fight booked in the next couple of weeks or month or so. And finally, in the main event, Jamie Pickett defeats Jonathan Patti via second round TKO, and this was a crazy performance by Jamie Pickett. I mean, what a finish. That was an insane finish, and of course he gets a contract too. An incredible knockout. Seriously, like the way he just exploded on Patti to get that finish was something really fun to watch. So very impressive performance by Pickett. He was the only one I got wrong on this card. I thought that based on his last couple performances, Contender Series, he wasn't good enough, but I think he is, and I think that definitely showed that in this fight, and it was a good performance, and definitely worthy of a contract. And I loved his post-fight interview talking about how he like drives a truck like all day, just trying to provide for his family, and now he makes it to the UFC, and how he was, just training his ass off for this fight, driving like 2 hours each way to the gym to train with, I think he said John Salter. So, this guy is definitely a good talent, and I'm glad he's in the UFC. I mean, I think this was a good signing. So overall, 4 contracts handed out, and I honestly have no problem with any of the deals. Obviously, some people thought Romero should have got one too, but I'm okay with him not getting one. All right, let's get to UFC on ESPN Plus 33. Just a small update for this card. So, of course, myself and Cole did break down the entire card on Tuesday's podcast. Definitely go back and check that out if you missed it. But there was one shakeup here. Giga Chikadze, who was supposed to fight Alex Caceres on the card, he is now out of the fight. And on short notice stepped Kevin Croom for like less than a day. Kevin Croom was signed and then cut according to his social media. I don't know what the problem was, if it was a weight cut thing, if he told me he could make weight and then realized he couldn't, or if it was a drug testing issue, or if it was something else. I have no idea. He said it was something out of his control, so who knows what happened. But Croom is not in the UFC now. Maybe he'll get there again one day, but definitely interesting to see what happened there. But yeah, Giga's out, Croom's out, and now Caceres does have an opponent. Austin Springer will be Alex Caceres' opponent. And the interesting thing about this guy is he actually beat Giga Chikadze on the Contender Series in 2018 by submission. He has one fight since then. He won that fight. He's a guy that hasn't been that active. I don't know how they got this guy in such short notice. Hopefully he can make the weight. This could be one of those situations where it's a catchweight fight at like 150 or something, because this is a guy who hasn't fought in over a year. Actually, not over a year, but about 11 months now. It's close to that. So it's been a while since he's fought, but he's also 33 years old. I have no idea if this guy can make the weight on short notice, but interesting signing. I mean, you got to give it up for these guys, like they persevere, right? Because he's won 3 straight fights after losing 3 of his last 4 fights before that. So he's a guy that has a decent amount of experience. He's fought in Bellator. He's fought in the Ultimate Fighter. He actually fought at Bellator 101, who headlined this card. Joe Warren headlined the card. So he's been around for a little while now, this guy. Will Brooks was also on that card. Remember that one. So, yeah, I think this is a good signing. I mean, this guy has, like I said, some decent wins. He has a win over Giga by submission. So if you're looking for a replacement for Giga, might as well get the guy that beat him, right? I like the signing. We'll see what happens. I mean, this is a guy that probably should have picked up on Contender Series. I don't know if this is a good spot for him coming in on short notice. I expect him to be a pretty big dog here. Caceres should be favored in this fight. And for Alex Caceres, I mean, this is a pretty good situation for him, right? Like, personally, because a lot of us thought he was going to lose to Giga. He gets a fight against Croom that looked winnable. Now he gets an even more winnable fight, arguably, against Austin Springer, a guy who's a talented fighter, just hasn't fought much and is also a little bit older. So I like the spot for Caceres. I expect him to be favored here, and he probably should win the fight. My pick's going to be Caceres to win, probably decision. All right, let's get to some news here. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I want to talk about Dana White's press conference from the Contender Series. So he was asked a lot of questions about a number of different topics, but the number one thing that everyone's talking about right now is what's going on with Jon Jones. And we all know that Jon Jones vacated the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship. He intends on moving to heavyweight for his next challenge. And I love the move for him. This is a move I've been calling for many years now, and I think Jon Jones at heavyweight is going to be a sight to see. Dana White confirmed that Jon Jones could get an immediate heavyweight title shot, which obviously brings off some alarm bells in people's ears, especially Francis Ngannou. So the plan right now is to have Stipe versus Ngannou too. That's the plan. But as soon as Jon Jones moved up to heavyweight, guys, I said on the podcast, I was like, you know what? Who knows? Dana White might change his mind because Jon Jones is a bigger name. He's a bigger fight. It's a bigger money fight, I think, with Stipe. The Ngannou fight versus Stipe should be a good fight. It's a great fight. I mean, if that's the only fight that's available, that's a great fight. But once Jon Jones moved up and you had that option to do the fight with Stipe, I think you have to strike while the iron's hot. So, yes, Dana White did not explicitly say that Jon Jones will be fighting Stipe next, but he left the door open. And I think that's enough of room for Jones to sneak in that door and get that title shot. So we'll see. We'll see. I mean, Ngannou deserves it. Don't get me wrong, he does, but Jones deserves it too. So it's a tough spot for the UFC, I think, right now to pick who they want to go with. But don't be surprised if Jon Jones gets that title shot. And I don't have a problem with it if it happens, by the way. If it does happen, you got to feel bad for Francis. Maybe they'll give him some money to just have him just chill out for a bit. But I'm sure he wants to fight for that belt next. If they do Francis Stipe, like at the end of the year, December, or maybe January, then you could have Jones fight Stipe or Francis, the winner of that fight, maybe next summer. But that seems like a long wait for Jones to fight again, doesn't it? I know the UFC wants him to fight with fans and stuff like that, but at this point, they have no idea when the fans are going to come back anyway. So we'll see what happens, but I'm not going to be surprised at all if the UFC announces that Jon Jones will be fighting Stipe and not Francis Ngannou. Next up, Dana White spoke about Anderson Silva and confirmed he will be retiring after the Uriah Hall fight. Anderson Silva also spoke to ESPN, and he essentially confirmed that, although he kind of is leaving the door open a little bit, which of course, makes it not really confirming it at all. But yeah, it seems like it's going to be his last fight, especially in the UFC. I believe Dana White recently said he had 2 fights left, so I'm not sure if Dana was wrong and it actually only is 1 fight, for it was 2, and Anderson agreed not to fight that last one. But I'm a little surprised he's leaving money on the table if that's the case, if he does have 2 fights left. But this is a fight that it's an important fight for Anderson Silva, obviously. It's a great fight, too. Uriah Hall and Anderson Silva, 2 high-level strikers. It's a fight that a lot of people, I think, have wanted to see for a long time. Uriah Hall is a guy that a lot of people compared to Anderson Silva for a long time. Not sure if I buy those comparisons or ever did, but it should be an interesting fight. Anderson Silva, 45 years old now. Oldest fighter in the UFC. I could definitely see why he would be walking away. He's obviously hasn't had much success the last few years. He's lost his last 2 fights. Honestly, he should have lost Derek Brunson too. So really, he should be on like a 5-fight losing streak right now. Guy is a legend. He is one of the greatest of all time. But everyone's career comes to an end at some point, and it looks like Anderson Silva will probably retire after this fight with Uriah Hall. But again, we'll see what happens. And speaking of retirements, Diego Sanchez says he's contemplating retirement, which surprised me because Diego Sanchez is a guy that has been very stubborn. People have said that they're worried about him, concerned about him, and stuff like that. And he's always kind of ignored that and said he's feeling good, he feels great. But he did recently confirm with Mike Swick in an interview on his podcast that he is considering retirement. He says the Jake Matthews fight at UFC 253 might be it for him. I wish he had a better fight if that's going to be his last fight. I mean, Jake Matthews is a decent fighter. It's a decent matchup, but that doesn't seem like the kind of fight that Diego would want to retire off of. So he did say he has a 4-fight deal with the UFC right now. Somehow he's won 3 of his last 4 fights. Like, I have no idea how, because he's a guy that a lot of people have just been writing off for a long time. But he's won 3 of his last 4 fights, including wins over Pereira, Gall, and Craig White. So I mean, he looked decent. Although Pereira fight should have been probably a TKO loss. Although he made a mistake and DQ'd himself, so it is what it is. But I love Diego. He's a legend. He's going to go in the Hall of Fame one day. But I'm glad he's actually listening to people now and saying, you know what, maybe it's time that I need to think about the next phase of my career. And if he does retire, I think that would be it for him. I don't think he'd be a guy that would go to like Bellator or something like that. I don't think so. I mean, maybe a lot of these guys, obviously like Tito and Bonner and all these guys that left the UFC ended up going to Bellator later in their career. But I feel like Diego would be one of those guys that kind of is a UFC lifer and just kind of end his career. But we'll see what happens. I definitely think that is a good move for him, though, to at least start thinking about the next phase of what he wants to do in his life. And speaking of retirement, Javier Mendez, he wants Daniel Cormier to retire. He just says that that's it for him. He says he's not the same guy he was a few years ago. And, you look at the 2 Stipe fights and you can kind of see where he's coming from. I mean, obviously Stipe's elite. He's elite. He's one of the best ever. So it's hard to say like Cormier sucks now or something like that because he lost to Stipe. But there was signs in those fights where he is slowing down and he's getting a little older now. He's 41. DC's a guy who's made a lot of money. It's really unfortunate that he kind of had a late start to his career. I think he started around age 30. It's unfortunate he didn't start when he was a little bit younger, but man, he made the most of those 10 years. He was really an elite fighter in the sport. So you got to love DC, one of the greatest ever as well. But I think Javier Mendez is probably onto something. If your coach is saying that you should probably retire, and you probably should end up hanging up your gloves. Dana also mentioned, this is some other news that people are going to like, UFC 254 could get a really nice addition between Dustin Poirier and Tony Ferguson. And I talked about this on the podcast on Tuesday. And I said, this is perfect because it's insurance just in case something happens to Justin Gaethje or Khabib Nurmagomedov. This week's a really good move for the UFC if they were going to do that. And I like the move if they do add it to the card. Hopefully they do. And I actually posted a tweet about that card, and it kind of blew up because you look at what the main card could be, and it could be Khabib, Gaethje, main event, co-main event, Poirier, Ferguson. Also on the main card, Yair Rodriguez, Zabit Magomed, Robert Whittaker versus Jared Cannonier, and Rafael dos Anjos versus Islam Makhachev. That could be the 5-fight main card. That would be one of the greatest cards ever. Not to mention the fact it has Alexander Volkov versus Walt Harris, Cynthia Calvillo versus Lauren Murphy, and a couple other fights on the prelims. So this is a really good card so far. Hopefully they do add this fight to it. But wow, what a card it is. Let's get to some fight announcements now that are actually happening. Darrick Minner versus TJ Laramie. This should be a good fight. I'm looking forward to it. TJ Laramie was just signed off Contender Series. I had a feeling they'd put him in quick. He's a young kid. He's only 22. He's ready to go. He took no damage in his last fight either against Daniel Swain. Defeated him via TKO. Comes back here against Darrick Minner just a month later. Great fight. I mean, interesting fight and definitely a dangerous fight. Darrick Minner is a guy that, yeah, his record's not great, 24-11, and he has a lot of losses, a lot of submission losses, a couple stoppage losses from strikes too, but mostly submission losses, which is dangerous because Laramie definitely has a submission game. He can finish this guy on the ground, but he's a front runner, man, and he gets out there in the first round and he can finish guys. Darrick Minner can. So it's a dangerous fight for TJ Laramie. Of course, I will favor TJ Laramie. He's a younger fighter. He's 8 years younger. He's a prize prospect. Everyone's talking about him, and we've seen Darrick Minner have a couple shots against higher level competition. Generally, he loses those fights. Having said that, look how many finishes this guy has. He is dangerous. So, if he gets in there and locks up a choke in the first round while they're both dry, he can win this fight. My pick would be Laramie. That would be my lean, I should say. We don't have odds for it, obviously, but my lean is Laramie, although I do think Minner is a dangerous guy. All right, next up, we have Bryce Mitchell versus Andre Fili. I like this fight, too. This is a fun fight as well. Bryce Mitchell, a guy that recently jumped into the rankings. I mean, he's been impressive in the UFC, no doubt about it. I'm not super into his personality and his whole, give you the camo shorts thing. I think it's cool that he's got his own persona. That is cool. He's an Arkansas kid, and that's his thing. I mean, I'm not super into it, but I think that he's definitely developing a fan base. So I got to respect what he's doing. And for me, it's just his performance inside the octagon. He's looked good, 4-0. The fight with Matt Sales last year, he submitted him with a twister, and that was impressive. And bounced back recently. I shouldn't say bounced back. He just kept winning. The fight over Charles Rosa at UFC 249 looked really good in that fight. So this is a guy who's dangerous, and he's a good fighter, and he's young too. He's only 25 years old. So I've liked what I've seen from Bryce Mitchell in the UFC. He has the one loss in his whole career to Brad Katona, and that's it. And that was an Ultimate Fighter and exhibition fight. Other than that, guy's been impressive. So takes an Andre Fili here, a guy who's almost turned to a gatekeeper, I think, at 145, but a very dangerous gatekeeper in his last fight. Had a great fight with Jourdain, wins by split decision. He's won 3 of his last 4. He's a very tough guy to beat. He's a tough guy to look good against. You look at his career, it's difficult to finish this guy, but he's a really good opponent for these young up-and-coming guys to see really where they stack up. I do think that Mitchell's going to be favored in this fight just because he's unbeaten as a pro and because – man, I mean, that submission win over Sales with the twister. I mean, how do you not favor the guy against a lot of people? But, Andre Fili is a super dangerous guy. And stylistically, he does have decent wrestling. So if he keeps this fight standing, he'll probably have the striking advantage. But, again, can he keep it standing? I don't know. We'll see what happens. But great fight. Love the matchup. Renato Moicano, he's making his return. And he'll be taking on Magomed Mustafaev. So interesting fight here. And I should have mentioned, a lot of these cards are in September, October. So these are upcoming fights, but not in the next week or so. They're coming in the next month or two. Renato Moicano, 31 years old. He's coming off a win over Damir Hadzovic. Looked really good in that fight. Quick win, 44 seconds. You kind of thought the UFC might give him a higher level guy because he does have some good wins. I mean, he has a win over Calvin Kattar. A win over Jeremy Siemens. This is a dangerous guy overall in his career in the UFC, 6-3. So he has been inconsistent at times with the losses, but you look who he lost to: Aldo, Ortega, and Korean Zombie. Not bad losses. Anyways, he takes on Magomed Mustafaev here. And Magomed's a dangerous guy. He's only 3-2 in the UFC, but the wins were nice. The win over Rafael Fiziev knocked him out. I mean, that guy looks amazing right now. So that's a really good win. Also knocked out Proctor and Hallman. He did lose to Brad Riddle in his last fight. It was a close fight, lost the decision there, and then he got tapped by Kevin Lee a couple years ago. He's a guy that hasn't been too active in the UFC, unfortunately. 5 years in the UFC, 5 fights. I don't like that. I'd like to see him more active. But definitely a dangerous guy. McCann has been finished before, so perhaps if he can catches him on the chin, he could put him out. I expect McCann to be favored here. He's kind of a bigger name, but definitely a competitive fight. And the other fight announcement I want to mention here, Sean Strickland returned to the octagon when he takes on Wellington Turman. Man, I'm excited to see Strickland back. This is a guy that, wow, a few years ago, I mean, a lot of us were talking about him as like a future middleweight prospect that could make a run for the belt. He had a nice run in the UFC at one point. He had won 5 of 6 fights. Then he had a fight with Usman, and since then he just hasn't fought much. He has won 2 of his last 3 fights, but he hasn't fought in like almost 2 years now since he beat Nordin Taleb. I'm assuming he's had injuries and stuff like that, which is really unfortunate. But I'm glad that he is finally returned to the octagon. I mean, this guy is solid, guys. Overall in the UFC, 7-3. So, I mean, he has a nice record, and he's had some great performances, like the win over McDaniel in his debut. That was really nice. The win over Garcia, and the Taleb fight. So, I mean, this guy's been impressive. I like him. I think he's kind of underrated, but he hasn't fought in a long time, which is definitely worrisome. Turman coming off a knockout loss here to Sanchez, 1-2 in the UFC. Hasn't been too impressive. I think the UFC wants Strickland to get a win here against the guy who's very beatable, but, Turman's definitely dangerous too, and Strickland hasn't fought in a while, so who knows? We'll see how that fight goes. Let me take a look here. There's definitely some other fight announcements. Not like big name fights by any means, but definitely a few worth mentioning. And thanks, of course, to Marcel, who had on the podcast a few weeks ago. Does a great job collecting fight announcements. How about this fight? Casey Kenny, Hailey Alatang. That should be a fun fight at 135 coming up in October. Got a favorite Kenny, I think, in that fight, but Alatang's definitely a good fighter too. But this one, Sijara Eubanks versus Carol Rosa. I'm assuming Sarge will favor. That fight's actually happening next week, so we'll get odds on that soon. Chris Daukaus against Rodrigo Nascimento. Interesting fight here between 2 heavyweights. I like Daukaus, man, but Nascimento, he's looked actually really good in the UFC. He has submission skills too, so he's a dangerous guy. That could go either way. It really could. I like Daukaus. That man, he's tough. He's a tough dude. He had a nice debut, but Nascimento is actually a legitimate prospect, I think, in heavyweights. Just a couple other ones here. Sam Alvey will be taking in Dan Jung. Hopefully Dan Jung can actually make it to his fight this time. Fight with Ed Herman got canceled, but this fight will take place at UFC 253. What else? Jung Young Park. What the heck? Oh, yeah, Jung Young Park against John Phillips. Both these guys that had fights set for like the card 2 weeks ago, they had, I think, visa issues that fell through. Now they've been rescheduled. I think it's for Fight Island. Jung Young Park against John Phillips. Surprised they're giving John Phillips another fight, honestly. But I guess they felt bad for kind of throwing to the wolves there with Kamaev. And then the other fight here, actually a guy, Alzolino at BJPen.com broke the news of this one. Antonio Arroyo against Andreas Michaelides. Obviously not the biggest names in the middleweight division, but I'm definitely curious to see what happens in that fight. All right, let me just see if there's any other news I want to get to, but I think today's going to be a bit of a shorter show, which is good because the last couple of podcasts have been going a long time. I should mention if people that listen typically on like iTunes and stuff like that haven't seen the last episode up, there's just some issues with converting the files right now, so unfortunately I can't get that up yet, but hopefully today I want to get that up to people that do listen that way. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for today's show, guys. So you guys can follow me on Twitter at MMAOB. Podcast is available at MMAOddsbreaker.com. And like I mentioned, it's available outside YouTube at Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, I should say, Google Hangouts, a lot of different places. So there's definitely a place to get the podcast. I'll get that last episode up very soon. Also, you guys can check me out at bjpen.com. That's where all my news is and a lot of my articles. MARings.net as well. I just posted an article about Frankie Edgar and why the UFC should fast track him at 135 pounds. All right, that's going to be it for today's show, guys. I hope you guys have a great weekend and enjoy the fights. I'll be back on Tuesday to preview the next UFC card. Have a great day, guys, and have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.